Well, thank you for coming, and it's fantastic to be here to have an opportunity to talk about this, because I've been working with leaders for the whole of my adult life, and in the last wee while there's been more conversations about the times we live in and the complexity we're facing and how jolly hard it all is. So the question that I think we need to start off with, is it really getting more complex for leaders? My dad fought in the Second World War. He came out of the Second World War and came into a society that was completely turned on its head. And arguably, it was more complex then. So is it or isn't it? That's, I think we need to, before we go into the, hello Kate, before we go into the whole business of this complexity and the whole thing about VUCA and how it all is, we might pause and just ask that question, because we can start to generate a whole story. And I had this conversation about a month ago with with the director of tax for one of the leading organisations that we work with, and he was describing. He's not called Gabriel, by the way, but it'll do. He was describing his world, and he said, "This is what I used to have to do. I used to have to tax optimize. I used to have to keep as little money going out of the organisation as possible. I needed to keep me and all the other senior folk here out of prison, and I needed to pay as little as possible. And my job was really clear, because that's what I had to do. And it required some deep expertise of me, but I had one thing to do, and that was my job." And he said, now, this is my world. I've still got to optimize tax, but I now work for an organisation that needs to be visible and accountable, and is seen to be a responsible international citizen. And the interesting thing was, he said, we don't have to play at being a responsible international citizen. We have to be a responsible international citizen. And he said, we're being watched. Because we've said we will be a responsible international citizen, we're now being watched in a way that we weren't watched a few years ago by all sorts of people. And he said, my job now is to meet with governments and increasingly NGOs in order to talk about how we manage our tax affairs internationally. He was on his way to a meeting with a group of social activists that he said he would never ever have had that meeting a few years previously. And he said, in order to make all of that work, he's a guardian of genuinely high standards of integrity within his organisation. And then finally, he said, I can't take my eyes off social media for a minute, because things start running and I've got to be in there with whatever's going on. So that's now my current world, and that's my old world. Now, I don't think he's unusual in terms of the way that leaders describe things. I see this in our clients. I see this kind of way of things moving not only more quickly, but in more dimensions. I see that being talked about all the time. And I think it genuinely is more complex. I think what's being demanded of this leader is a shift from what was being demanded of him previously. One of the people whose work we really admire and has been very focal in terms of understanding this question of increased complexity is David Snowden. And if you haven't read this article, A Leader's Framework for Decision Making, which is an HBR article of 2007, so well dated, but absolutely relevant, he talks about the need for leaders to differentiate the issues that they're facing right now and what they're heading into. And he says one of the common mistakes that we make as leaders is to misdiagnose the nature of the things we are dealing with. And that misdiagnosing has a real consequence for our behaviour and how we head into the situations that we're facing. And this model, I think, is one of the most useful models that's around. And he says, basically, as leaders, we face a lot of problems which originally he described as simple, and he describes as obvious. These are the stuff that you know how to deal with. It's the stuff that you only have to engage a small proportion of your brain in order to sort out. So you deal with dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of obvious problems every day. So getting to here this morning, for those of you who don't work here, was a problem because you had to decide which route you're going to take and what's likely to be going on in the transport network. But you know how to do that, and you didn't really have to think very hard about it, and you got here. So those are obvious, and we have a gazillion of those every day. The real issue comes in the difference between complicated and complex. Complicated problems have multi-dimensions to them. It's in the description, they're much harder than obvious problems, but we basically know how to deal with them. They're problems that we recognize. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the medical world, where Hartil does a little bit of work, and talk about a complicated problem, which is a liver transplant. So it ain't easy to do a liver transplant. Some go wrong. Some don't work. However, everybody involved in the process of doing a liver transplant agrees what a positive outcome is. A positive outcome is patient survival, longevity of life, no side effects. So to do that, we need absolutely detailed precision. We need unbelievably high level of expertise, and we need coordination across disciplines. All of that is part of the process of a successful liver transplant. However, in order to do that, the technology is known and the process is repeated time and time again. So it's really difficult, but we know how to do it. Now, we have a whole load of those kind of issues, and I'm sure your industry is full of things that are really hard to achieve, but we've got a really good sense of how to achieve them. That contrasts with Snowden's description, which is complex problems. And complex problems have a very different nature to them. Complex problems have a quality of us not quite knowing how to deal with it. So if we think about the pressure on hospital beds that we see every year here in the UK, not the only country to have that, we've never seen a problem quite like it before, because we've never been at this point of technology before. We've never had this level of patient expectation before, and we've never had an NHS that works in quite this way before. So it's got kind of qualities of uniqueness to it. And ideas about causes vary. So if you talk to some hospital managers, they might talk about the conflict of interest that many consultants have between their private and their NHS responsibilities. If you talk to those consultants, you might hear about how inefficient the hospital managers are. And if you talk to the nurses, you might hear about under-resourcing. So everybody has a different story about this problem, which of course is what makes it complex. There are multiple interdependent stakeholders, and they're not dependent on each other. They are dependent on each other, but they don't have a close relationship. So, for example, the issue of patients moving out of hospital when they're well into care homes, social services responsibility. Social services separate from the health service in many contexts. So many attempts to improve this, many initiatives to make it better, will either have no impact or may make it worse. So that's the dimension of complex. So why is this significant? Well, it's significant because if you head into a problem that is complex as if it was complicated, you start doing things like saying we need more data. We need to analyze this further. We need to do what we've done before in order to make this work. And clearly, that's not quite the right way. A different kind of approach, a different kind of collaboration, and a different kind of inquiry is needed. So rather than taking a I know stance, the leader starts to have to take a curious, I wonder if stance. And that's a very different position for a leader to be taking. And so I think it's absolutely fascinating, because in a way, we're asking leaders to summon a different kind of intelligence. And that's the crucial bit that starts to play in here. We start to talk about things like wisdom. We start to talk about reflection and being able to stand back. We start to talk about collaboration. And all of those are massively significant in this.